Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you. My name is Alister McGrath and I'm the Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University. I'm recording this lecture in Oxford as my very busy schedule means I can't be present with you personally in Brazil. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you. This lecture is about the relation of the natural sciences and the Christian faith. And given the high profiles that both science and religion occupy in contemporary cultural debates, this is one of the most culturally significant and intellectually engaging themes of our age. Yet any discussion of the relation of the natural sciences and Christian theology must be located within a framework of understanding, which helps us to position them both. We need a big picture of reality, which does more than simply create space for science and theology, but helps us to see the nature, limits, and benefits of their interaction. There's growing interest across intellectual disciplines in retrieving this notion of a big picture, a rich way of seeing things which aims to frame and to hold together the elements of our experience and observation, bringing a sense of stability and coherence to life and thought. The New Testament speaks of the mind of Christ, a pattern of communal thinking about life and the world, which is disclosed in Jesus Christ as God incarnate. And from the outset, Christian theologians have realized the potential of their faith to generate and sustain a greater vision of life. C.S. Lewis, a writer who I admire greatly, once declared that his Christian faith allowed him to make sense of every other aspect of his rational and imaginative life, including the natural sciences. We all need some sort of theoretical framework, however modest, provisional, and correctable, for making sense of history, nature, and life. Whether consciously or unconsciously, we all see life through theoretical spectacles, which shape what we see and, perhaps more importantly, what we fail to see. That's why it matters to get the theory right. When I was a young man, I was an atheist. I was convinced that people believed in God because they were mad, bad, or sad. Back in the late 1960s, yes, I am very old, there was a widespread belief that religion was dying. Within decades, we were told, it would be extinct, relegated to history textbooks. A secular dawn lay just around the corner. But everything has changed from the 1960s when I was growing up. Back then, as the sociologists William Bainbridge and Rodney Stark pointed out, the most illustrious figures in sociology, anthropology, and psychology were unanimously of the view that they would live to see the dawn of a new era in which the infantile illusions of religion would be outgrown. But a generation later, this judgment can no longer be sustained. Religion has made an unexpected comeback. Far from dying out, belief in God has rebounded and seems set to exercise still greater influence in both the public and private spheres. The aggressive tone of the new atheism reflects this deep concern and their intense anxiety about the future of dogmatic atheism. The reason they're so angry about religion is that it's still here, and they have not been able to rebut it. That's why they use such aggressive rhetoric. They know they fail to make their case rationally, and so have to rely on ridicule and vilification instead. I'm one of those who experienced this renewal of faith myself. As a young man, I had read Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx and was convinced that religion was some kind of pathological disorder. It was an infantile delusion that shielded us from the realities of life. Then I discovered Christianity while studying the natural sciences at Oxford University. I began to realize that the case for atheism was much weaker than I had supposed. I began to become alarmed at the strident, dismissive tone of some atheist writings, which seemed more concerned to rubbish religion than to seek the truth. It wasn't long before I discovered two things that would change my personal world. First, I realized that Christianity made a lot of sense. It gave me a new way of seeing and understanding the world, above all, the natural sciences. Second, I began to see that Christianity actually worked, giving a sense of meaning to life. It wasn't just a set of interesting ideas, but something that brought purpose and dignity to life. This is an important point. These days, our postmodern culture's criterion of acceptability is not primarily, is it right, but rather, does it work? And it's obvious that religious belief works for many, many people, giving direction, purpose, and stability to their lives. The massive sales and impact of Rick Warren's book, The Purpose-Driven Life, which has sold far more copies than Richard Dawkins' God Delusion, is an obvious sign of this development. I kept on studying the sciences, which I still love, and gained a PhD from Oxford University for my research in molecular biophysics. But my heart and my mind have been seduced by theology, the systematic study of Christian ideas. Even to this day, it excites and thrills me. Now, science is one of humanity's most significant and most deeply satisfying achievements. Yet though I loved science as a young man, I had a sense that it wasn't complete. Science helped me to understand how things worked, but what did they mean? Science gave me a neat answer to the question of how I came to be in this world. Yet it seemed unable to answer a deeper question. Why was I here? What was the point of life? The question really is whether the natural sciences can help us engage with these deeper issues, which the philosopher Karl Popper famously framed in terms of ultimate questions. For Popper, these were existentially significant questions, rooted in the depths of our being, yet which transcended the capacity of the natural sciences to answer. The physicist John Wheeler argued that our scientific observations at best yield only an island of knowledge in an ocean of uncertainty. There are limits to science's capacity to answer fundamental philosophical questions of value and meaning, partly reflecting limitations on the part of the tools we use to explore reality, and partly the nature of physical reality itself. So why don't we just limit ourselves to the relative security of this small island of knowledge? There are two obvious answers. First, we sense that there is more that can be known and are restless until we find it. We find strange objects washed up on the shoreline of our island, possibly pointing to mysterious unknown worlds beyond its coast. And perhaps more significantly, the kind of knowledge that's to be had on this island is existentially inadequate. It doesn't answer the really big questions of life. That's why the Spanish philosopher José Ortega argued that we need more than the partial account of reality that science offers. Now listen to what he has to say. Scientific truth is characterized by its precision and the certainty of its predictions. But science achieves these admirable qualities by remaining on the level of secondary concerns, leaving ultimate and decisive questions untouched. So Ortega insists we need a big picture, an integral idea of the universe, which possesses existential depth. Science has a wonderful capacity to explain, while nevertheless failing to satisfy the deeper longings and questions of humanity. For Ortega, the great intellectual virtue of science is that it knows its limits, which are determined by its research methods, not by artificial or arbitrary constraints. At its best, science will only answer questions that it knows it can answer on the basis of the evidence. Yet human beings want to press beyond the point at which science declares that it must stop if it's to remain faithful to its methodological commitments. We want to ask deeper questions about meaning and try to find a big picture which makes sense of life as a whole. As Ortega rightly observed, human beings, whether scientists or not, cannot live without trying to answer these deeper questions. He writes, "We are given no escape from ultimate questions. In one way or another they are in us, whether we like it or not. Scientific truth is exact, but it is incomplete." So science is very good at taking things to pieces, yet analysis is not enough. We need to weave the various elements of our world in order to perceive the big picture. The great physicist Albert Einstein explored this point in a landmark lecture given at Princeton Theological Seminary in 1939 on the general theme of science and religion. Noting that until quite recently it was widely held that there was an irreconcilable conflict between knowledge and belief, Einstein pointed out how this view needed to be challenged. He's right. We now know that the idea that science and religion are permanently and necessarily in conflict with each other is an invention of the late 19th century, which the new atheism of Richard Dawkins and others has converted into a secular dogma. This idea of the warfare of science and faith is now regarded widely as being discredited, even if it's constantly repeated in the media today. Einstein, however, had more to say on his theme. He insisted that the natural sciences were outstanding in their sphere of competence, yet he stressed the limits of the sciences. The scientific method can teach us nothing else beyond how facts are related to and conditioned by each other. Human beings need more than what a purely rational conception of our existence is able to offer. Now, this doesn't mean that thinking about fundamental questions of meaning and value causes us to lapse into some kind of irrationality. Listen to Einstein. Objective knowledge provides us with powerful instruments for the achievements of certain ends, but the ultimate goal itself and the longing to reach it must come from another source. Let me read you the final part of Einstein's sentence again. The ultimate goal itself and the longing to reach it must come from another source. Do you see the point he's making? There has to be something beyond science for us to discover. Einstein's point is echoed by Sir Peter Medawar, a British biologist who championed the public engagement of science. Listen to his statement. Only humans find their way by a light that illuminates more than the patch of ground they stand on. Medawar was suggesting that human beings seem to possess and be driven by some innate desire to reach beyond the mechanics of engagement with our world, looking for deeper patterns of significance and meaning. There seems to be something about human identity that involves a quest for something deeper than we find through an examination of the empirical world. The large body of research literature on this topic suggests that human beings cope better with our complex and messy world if we feel that we can discern meaning and value within our own lives and in the greater order of things around us. Yet science can only offer limited guidance as we reflect on the issues of meaning and value. Two themes are of major importance in thinking about the interaction of the natural sciences and Christian theology: intelligibility and coherence. Both the natural sciences and Christian theology, though in their own distinct ways, offer a coherent and rationally motivated account of the world in which we live and think. The significance of the first of these two themes, intelligibility, is easily grasped. We long for a framework that helps us to make sense of what we observe around us and experience within us. I was drawn to Christianity because I sensed it allowed me to grasp and hold on to the intelligibility of our world. And I continue to value C.S. Lewis's famous statement, now inscribed on his memorial stone in Poets' Corner, Westminster Abbey. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Let me read that again. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. My own time as a scientist impressed on me how much science depends on being able to investigate a universe that is both rationally transparent and imaginatively beautiful, capable of being represented in elegant mathematical forms. One of the most significant parallels between the natural sciences and Christian theology is a fundamental conviction that the world is characterized by regularity and intelligibility. There's something strange about both the world itself and the human mind, which allows the patterned regularity within nature to be discerned, represented, and understood. And this perception of cosmic ordering and intelligibility is of immense significance, both at the scientific and religious levels. As the physicist Paul Davies points out, in Renaissance Europe, the justification for what we today call the scientific approach to inquiry was the belief in a rational God whose created order could be discerned from a careful study of nature. Yet, how are we to account for this regularity of nature, or for the human ability to represent it so well? Why is nature actually intelligible to us? The human capacity for understanding our world seems to be far in excess of anything that could reasonably be considered to be an evolutionary strategy for conferring survival advantage, or simply a fortuitous byproduct of the evolutionary process. Now, that's one of the reasons why the philosophy of science has moved away from the radical positivism of the early 20th century, which asserted that science merely established purely functional relations between the data we observe through our senses. This outdated approach suggested there was no big picture. At best, there were working correlations between observations, which makes the universe intelligible in the first place. Any claim that went beyond empirical observation was not open to demonstration and was hence deemed to be unscientific. Science was understood simply to catalogue the relationships between observations, making no attempt to synthesize its own view of reality. That view now lies largely in the past. Most would agree with the philosopher of science Michael Polanyi when he declared that the purpose of science is to discover the hidden reality underlying the facts of nature, which makes the universe intelligible in the first place. Now, the British quantum theoretician and theologian John Polkinghorne is a good example of a reflective scientist who sees the core methods and assumptions of the natural sciences as fitting in naturally within a Christian way of thinking. There is, he argues, I quote, a congruence between our minds and the universe, between the rationality experienced within and the rationality observed without. A naturalistic metaphysics is unable to cast light on this deep intelligibility of the universe. Now, we might have to treat this as a fortunate accident which requires no discussion or explanation. However, Christianity provides a big picture, a way of seeing things that affirms a common origin for both the rationality within our minds and the rational structure of the physical world around in the rationality of God. In other words, Christianity offers a framework which makes sense of what is otherwise a happy cosmic coincidence or accident. Others have pointed to the growing interest in what are now generally termed anthropic phenomena, and suggested these are also consonant with a Christian way of thinking. The heavily freighted vocabulary of fine-tuning is widely used to express the idea that the universe appears to have possessed certain qualities from the moment of its inception which were favourable to the production of intelligent life, capable of reflecting on the implications of its existence. Nature's fundamental constants turn out to have been fine-tuned to reassuringly life-friendly values. The existence of carbon-based life on Earth depends upon a delicate balance of physical and cosmological forces and parameters, which are such that were any one of these quantities to be slightly altered, this balance would have been destroyed and life would not have come into existence. Now, as I noted in my 2009 Gifford lectures at the University of Aberdeen, these prove nothing, and other explanations are certainly possible. But the Christian mental map makes sense of this aspect of the natural world, as it does of so much of the scientific enterprise. It is both empirically adequate and existentially satisfying. Yet there is another theme that needs to be set alongside this quest for intelligibility: the search for coherence. Christianity provides a web of meaning, a deep belief in the fundamental interconnectedness of things. It's like standing on the top of a mountain and looking down at a patchwork of villages, houses, roads, fields, streams and forests. We can take snapshots of everything we see, like these. But what we really need is a panorama that holds these snapshots together, that lets us see that there is a big picture and that each of these little pictures has its place within that greater whole. There is the snapshot, and there is the big picture within which the snapshot fits. You see the point? The fear of many is that reality consists simply of isolated and disconnected episodes, incidents, and observations. Our modern age has seen the emergence of significant doubts about the coherence of reality, many of which arise from the new philosophy of the scientific revolution. Do new scientific ideas destroy any idea of a meaningful reality? So how could a coherent vision of the world be sustained? Christians find this theme eloquently engaged in the New Testament, which speaks of all things holding together or being joined together in Christ. In a brief discussion of Dante's Divine Comedy, C.S. Lewis noticed its powerful imaginative vision of a unified cosmic and world order. It reflected, he wrote, a unity of the highest order because it could cope with the greatest diversity of subordinated detail, yielding a coherent whole. Now, Lewis isn't really offering a logical argument here. His appeal is not to the reason through logic, but to the imagination through beauty. He wants to help believers to hear the harmonies of the cosmos and realize that things fit together aesthetically, even if there are a few logical loose ends that still need to be sorted out. The medieval vision of the universe, he suggested, was overwhelming in its greatness, but satisfying in its harmony. Now, Christian theology has always realized that there is a hidden web of meaning and connectedness behind the ephemeral and seemingly incoherent world that we experience. The British novelist Virginia Woolf occasionally explained short, stabbing instances of insight, which she called moments of being, that seemed to reveal some real thing behind appearances. Yet such moments of insight were so brief that she could never capture the vision of connectedness that they suggested. The philosopher Michael Polanyi argues that the discernment of the intelligibility of the universe also extends to a recognition of its coherence. And he wrote, "To discover a true coherence in nature is often not only to discern something which by the mere fact of being real necessarily points beyond itself, but to surmise that future discoveries may prove the reality of the thing to be far deeper than we can at present imagine." So how is such coherence to be captured and represented scientifically? Polanyi appeals to the creative human imagination as the means by which this elusive notion is to be grasped. He writes, "The final sanction of a discovery lies in the sight of a coherence, which our intuition detects and accepts as real. It's not a quantifiable notion, but it rests on a discernment of a pattern, resting on a judgment that's more aesthetic than logical in nature." So Christianity offers us a vision of reality which helps us to grasp both its rational transparency and its interconnectedness. It reassures us of the coherence of reality, that however fragmented our world of experience may seem, there is a half-glimpsed bigger picture which holds things together, its threads connecting together in a web of meaning what might otherwise seem incoherent and pointless. Science takes the world to pieces so we can see how things work. The Christian faith puts those pieces back together again so that we can see what they mean. So have we lost sight of this idea of some deeper unity of reality? Where once there was a sense of intellectual and moral coherence to reality, there now seems to be what the German poet and novelist Hermann Hesse described as a mere aggregation of intellectual fashions and the transitory values of the day. Other intellectual developments have also called into question the idea of a coherent reality. For example, Nancy Cartwright developed the idea of the world as a patchwork quilt of divergent orders and rationalities reflecting local rather than universal laws of nature. Well, C.S. Lewis argued that we are not reading rationality into an irrational universe, but responding to a rationality with which the universe has always been saturated. Cartwright holds that we impose such a single order of rationality, when in reality there are a variety of orderings requiring multiple accounts of the natural world and its structures. In fact, there might be no order at all. For Lewis, we are responding to the universe as it actually is. For Cartwright, we run the risk of inventing our own universe and disregarding the one around us. The Christian faith has the potential to enrich a scientific narrative by preventing it from collapsing into what the British poet John Keats described as a dull catalogue of common things. The German sociologist Max Weber used the term disenchantment to refer to an excessively intellectual and rationalizing way of looking at nature which limited to what could be measured and quantified. Now, many scientists listening to this lecture will perfectly reasonably point out that these processes of quantifying and reduction are integral to the scientific method. And I agree. It's just that there's a lot more that needs to be said. Science is really good at taking things apart so we can see how they work, but faith puts them back together again so we can see what they mean. Our religious perspective does not in any way deny the scientific utility of such a rationalizing or reductive approach, although it does challenge its finality. It simply insists that a fuller and more satisfying account of reality can be provided and offers a supplementation of a scientific narrative by which this might be achieved. Now, the philosopher Mary Midgley suggests that the landscape of reality is so complex that we need to use multiple maps if we are to grasp the depths and detail of reality. Appreciating the complex texture of our world of observation and experience requires many maps and many windows, in that there are many independent forms and sources of knowledge. And she suggests it's helpful to think of the world as a huge aquarium. Listen to what she says. We cannot see it as a whole from above, so we peer in at it through a number of small windows. We can eventually make quite a lot of sense of this habitat if we patiently put together the data from different angles. But if we insist that our own window is the only one worth looking through, we shall not get very far. For Midgley, no single way of thinking is adequate to provide, on its own, an understanding of the meaning of our world. Science can only fill in part of the big picture of our world. It needs supplementation from other research methods and traditions if the full picture is to be fleshed out. She writes, for most important questions in human life, a number of different conceptual toolboxes always have to be used together. Now, if we limit ourselves to the methods of natural sciences in general, or one specific science like physics in particular, we end up locking ourselves into a bizarrely restrictive view of meaning. Insisting that we only use scientific methods or forms or categories restricts us to a narrow world which excludes meaning and value, not because they're absent, but because the research method prevents them from being seen. I've already spoken about science and faith as offering different perspectives on reality. Let me now turn to consider how they offer different levels of explanation. Science and religion offer answers at differing levels. The best picture of reality is that which weaves together coherently the greatest number of explanatory threads. The distinguished geologist Frank Rhodes, who served as president of Cornell University from 1977 to 1995, made this point some time ago using the analogy of a boiling kettle. He asks us to consider this question: why is the kettle boiling? Rhodes notes that two levels of explanation could be given. Here's the scientific explanation. A process of energy conversion and transfer raises the temperature of the water to its boiling point. Yet another answer can be given at a different level. The kettle is boiling because I put it on to make a cup of tea. So which of these answers is right? Does the first answer mean the second must be wrong? Or are they each part of a bigger picture? Here's Rhodes' own answer. Now, these are different answers, but both are true. Both are complementary and not competitive. One answer is appropriate within a particular frame of reference, the other within another frame of reference. There's a sense in which each is incomplete without the other. Now, Rhodes' basic point is that both answers can be right because they are concerned with different levels of reality. One answers the question how, the other the question why. It's instructive to compare this with the rather unperceptive analysis offered by Richard Dawkins. For Dawkins, there are scientific and religious ways of responding to reality. By definition, they both can't be right. So we must choose the scientific account. But you can see immediately the problem with what Dawkins proposes. Let's go back to that analogy of the kettle. Why is the kettle boiling? Dawkins allows only a scientific answer to this question, an answer which is about energy conversion and transfer. This is true as far as it goes, but it's only part of the answer, and we need the full answer. We need to know that one of the reasons that the kettle is boiling is my desire for a cup of tea. So you can see that Dawkins' approach is necessarily deficient and inadequate. We need a bigger picture, which weaves together many explanatory threads, only some of which are scientific. The point is that a single research method can only engage one level of what is usually a multi-layered reality, in effect preventing us from seeing or engaging other levels. The Scottish neuroscientist Donald Mackay made this point using a helpful analogy. The scientific method has been compared to a net, which can give knowledge only of those aspects of reality which it can catch. The kind of description which it can give passes by spiritual truths. So the point here is that the research method determines what can be seen and also what cannot be seen. Now, Midgley's basic principle of using multiple maps to represent a complex reality raises some challenges and some significant questions, such as how to develop and deploy an appropriate interpretive framework to settle boundary disputes. But it also opens up some important possibilities for the enrichment of our vision of life in the world. We need a lavish palette of colours to represent the complexities of our observations of the world around us and our experience within us. If we were to use a severely limited range of colours, such as the drab and shallow shades of grey proposed by scientism, we would limit the scope and depth of our grasp of the world, simply because we would have closed down the research methods and traditions that might enable us to see further and more clearly. A research method designed for one purpose won't work for others. It simply renders us blind to everything outside its own sphere of competence. Science cannot detect meaning. Yet this doesn't mean that there is no meaning to be detected. The approach that I set out in this lecture is best described as the interweaving of narratives, allowing their mutual enrichment. It's reasonably well understood that human beings construct their identities using multiple narratives. That's how we function as social animals. We knit together religious, political, social, and cultural narratives as we try to make sense of our world. It's natural for us to weave these threads together, just as it's also natural for us to try and sort out how they interact. Which of them takes priority? How do we resolve tensions or seeming contradictions between them? Yet the really important point is this. No one story, no one angle of gaze or tradition of investigation is adequate to deal with human existence in all its richness and complexity. This interweaving of narratives is essential as we try to deal with the ultimate questions that persistently refuse to go away. To answer these properly, we need to bring together multiple approaches and recognize the existence of multiple levels of meaning, such as our sense of purpose in life, our values, our sense of individual efficacy, and a basis for our self-esteem. Each view of reality, whether scientific or religious, needs to be valued in its own right, yet used in conjunction with others to render the rich texture and vibrancy of our world. And I propose a richer narrative, linking understanding and meaning, aiming to address what the American philosopher John Dewey once declared to be the deepest problem of modern life, which is, according to Dewey, our collective and individual failure to integrate our thoughts about the world with our thoughts about value and purpose. Perhaps I might offer an example to illustrate what I have in mind. I vividly recall looking at the night sky on winter nights in the late 1960s and seeing the belt of Orion, those three bright stars at the centre of the constellation of Orion. I was an atheist back in those days with no interest in God, but already knowing a deep sense of awe at the wonder of nature. I knew enough about astronomy to know that light took hundreds of years to travel to Earth from those stars. To look at those stars was, in effect, to travel back in time, I was seeing them as they were, not as they are. And I found that thought deeply troubling. Why? Because by the time the light now leaving those stars reached Earth, I would be dead. And those stars became for me symbols of my own mortality, chilling silent reminders of the brevity of human life. The universe might be very beautiful, but it also seemed totally pointless. It's a melancholy thought known to many scientists. For example, Ursula Goodenough, a biologist at the University of Washington, recalls being overwhelmed with terror at the thought of the immensity of the universe and the fact that it would one day come to an end. No longer could she appreciate the beauty of the stars. They now represented meaninglessness and despair. Listen to what she wrote. The night sky was ruined. I would never be able to look at it again. I wept into my pillow the long, slow tears of adolescent despair. A bleak emptiness overtook me whenever I thought about what was really going on out in the cosmos or deep in the atom. So I did my best not to think about such things. But what would have happened if I had then seen the night sky, the world through a God lens, through a theistic schema? I later discovered that the night sky looked very different when seen from the standpoint of faith. Yes, it was a symbol of immensity, against which I seemed insignificant. Yet I now realized that, despite my cosmic insignificance and brief lifespan, I mattered to someone and something deeper. One of the world's most famous photographs was taken in 1990 from the Voyager space probe during its mission to study the outer solar system. 12 years after its launch, it reached the planet Saturn and sent back images of this great planet. The astronomer Carl Sagan suggested playfully that the probe's cameras should show where it had come from, not simply where it was going. And after much negotiation, NASA agreed that Voyager would send back an image of Earth, seen from a distance of about 6 billion kilometers. That's how we came to see the famous image of planet Earth as a pale blue dot, set against the darkness of space, a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. How small and insignificant we seem compared with the vastness of space. To this day, I keep on looking at that image from Voyager, that minuscule pale blue dot, which is our cosmic home. And I find my thoughts straying to one of the Psalms, which seems to anticipate the thoughts and emotions I now experience when looking at that lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. Listen to these lines from Psalm 8. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them, mortals that you care for them? The psalm exults that human beings are part of God's creation and are thus both named and loved by the God from whom all things come. Our lives are touched by transcendence in that God chooses to relate to those whom he created. I've explored this idea in a number of my books, and I'd like to recommend one in particular which has recently been translated into Portuguese. It's a very accessible version of my 2009 Gifford Lectures, which was published with the English title Surprised by Meaning, Science, Faith, and How We Make Sense of Things. It's very easy to read, and it's been very well received by its many readers. If you enjoyed this lecture, this work will help you explore further most of its central themes. Here are the contents of the book. As you can see, it touches on some of the major issues relating to science and faith, such as our search for a big picture of life and how Christianity provides this, our desire to make sense of our world and our lives, the limits of science, and the rationality of faith, especially in the light of criticisms made by atheists such as Richard Dawkins. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I must conclude. Here's the point I want to make in closing. We all need a greater narrative to make sense of the world and our lives, naturally weaving together multiple narratives and multiple maps to give us the greatest possible traction on reality. Reality is just too complex to be engaged and inhabited using only one tradition of investigation. That, I suggest, is why we need both a robust theology and an informed science. We need the best picture of ourselves and our world that we can devise if we are to inhabit it meaningfully and authentically. And I hope that this short lecture will help set the scene for your discussions of this wonderful and important theme. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.